Hey, Mr. B here. In this video, we're going to talk specifically about the blood system, but within the context or through the context of how the heartbeat is controlled. We've talked in previous videos about the anatomy of vessels, specifically capillaries, veins, and arteries. We talked about what each of them are, what each of them have in terms of adaptations, why they have the adaptations they do, what those adaptations allow them to do, why they are structured the way that they are so that they can ultimately function the way they do. We then got into the anatomy of the heart, which is really important for us to understand as we move into this particular video, which again is how the heartbeat is controlled. So if you have questions leading into how the heartbeat is structured, or how the heart is structured, how the anatomy of the heart works, why the heart is anatomically structured the way that it is, see my previous videos. Otherwise, let's go. So before we talk about how or why the heartbeat is controlled, okay, how it's controlled and why it's controlled the way that it is, we need to kind of identify a few terms first. So a few terms we need to understand is myogenic muscle contraction and indefatigable. Myogenic muscle contraction means that the heart is made of muscle, okay, it's made of myocytes, and these myocytes actually are the origin of the contraction, and everything contractually speaking happens in-house, okay? There is no external contraction or no external force that impacts the rate at which the heart is beating. During times of rest, okay? Normal heartbeat, resting heart rate is controlled in-house, internally, and is not dictated by any external factor, which is really important because that frees up a lot of brain capacity. It frees up a lot of conscious thought. It frees up a lot of nerve impulses that can be sent other places. Okay, we do not need to physically think about or maintain the contraction of our heart like we do other muscles in order to bring about some kind of response. So, myocytes are the origin of contraction, and it is all internally originating. Okay, the heartbeat internally originates within the heart. Now, the heart rate can be, and we're going to go through this in a minute, but the heart rate can be externally moderated. Okay, we can speed up or slow down our heart rate unconsciously based on hormone responses or nerve impulses from the brain. We're going to get into kind of what the stimuli might be in order to bring about that response. But we're, again, right now talking about just at rest, the autonomic nervous system, okay, which is the automatic nervous system. It's the part of the nervous system that brings about automatic responses. Kind of our homeostatic balance is all contained within our autonomic nervous system, and the heart rate can be controlled by that as well. So those are brought about by changes in the body, like I talked about. If our blood O2 concentration drops too low, it's going to bring about a certain response. If our CO2 concentration or raises or elevates too high, that's going to bring about a response. Okay? If our body is getting too hot or too cold, it's going to stimulate a response. Those are all automatic responses that try to bring about a process called homeostasis, which is a really important principle of everything that is alive. Okay? The second term is the indefatigable. So that's really important because that means that these muscle cells, these myocytes that make up the tissues of the heart, cannot get fatigued. Okay, other muscles, other skeletal muscles, leg muscles, arm muscles, grip muscles, muscles that are in charge of moving your body physically, those are muscles that are made of myocytes that can fatigue, which you've probably experienced when you're doing things like weightlifting or sports or that kind of thing, trying to move something heavy around your house. Obviously, you can feel in real time your muscles fatiguing. Your skeletal muscles cannot support large loads for long periods of time without fatiguing. Now, your heart muscles, your heart myocytes are indefatigable, which is really important because they can continually contract 24/7, 365 around the clock and do not fatigue. It's really important. If your heart muscle cells fatigued like the rest of your skeletal muscles, you would be in serious jeopardy of muscle failure or heart failure, which obviously has life implications. So, myocytes indefatigable. One thing to kind of start this, how the heartbeat is controlled talk, is through a structure called the SA node. The sinoatrial node is the pacemaker of the heart. So what does pacemaker mean? It is the structure that is setting the pace. What is the pace? It's heart rate. Okay, sinoatrial node is the origin of the stimuli, nerve impulse, that ultimately dictates the pace of your heart rate. Okay, what is the heart rate? It's the rate at which the muscles of the heart are contracting. So the pacemaker controls the rate of the contraction. Now, it's really important to understand too that the SA node is not being externally influenced. Okay, it is not like you do have a brain, right? And that brain can send nerve impulses to the heart, which we'll talk about in a minute. But your brain doesn't have to send these impulses to the sinoatrial node. We already talked about all of that. Electrical stimulus is controlled in-house. So the sinoatrial node can actually generate its own electrical stimuli or its own electrical stimulus, its own electrical impulse from this node, and will be sent through these nerves to various parts of the heart. Okay, but the SA node, the sinoatrial node, is the pacemaker of the heart. The first section of the heart, which we've talked about in our last video, are the atria. Okay, the top portion of the heart on both the right and left side are called the atria. Now, we talked about in our last video as well that the atria do have much thinner muscle tissue walls than the ventricles. Ventricles are going to contract at a much intense, okay, or higher intensity contraction than the atria, but the atria do contract like the ventricles. So atria are going to contract first, ventricles are going to contract second, but both of them are going to be, like I said, stimulus or stimulated by an electrical impulse from the SA node. There is another node down here on this particular diagram. Sometimes you'll see it more up here, sometimes you'll see it down here, but this is the atrioventricular node. That should be a term that is relatively speaking easy to remember because it is sitting right by this AV valve, which is an atrioventricular valve. Okay, remember that the atrioventricular valves are the valves that are sitting right between the atria and ventricles, and they're designed to prevent the backflow of blood from ventricle into the atria when the ventricles are contracting. Okay, so you have the SA node, you have the atrioventricular node, you have the nerves that are linking the SA node and the atrioventricular node, and then the atrioventricular node is going to send the impulse or relay the impulse from the SA node to the ventricles. Okay. Obviously, the ventricles are on the bottom of the heart. Both the left and right ventricles are both going to contract. They're both going to push blood from the ventricle into the arteries that are leaving the heart. Obviously, one set of arteries is going to be leaving the heart heading to the lungs. The other set of arteries is going to be leaving the heart and heading to the body tissues, both of which are arteries and both of which are important. These little purple structures in this particular diagram are nerves, and like I said, this kind of shows you the route that the nerves take from SA node, which is the pacemaker, all the way through the atria and ventricles in order to stimulate the contraction. So, what happens is a wave of excitations is sent from this SA node to the atria and is going to cause the atria to contract first. That is the first part of any heartbeat. Okay? Just think about the speed at which these nerves are traveling, and think about the route that they're taking, and think about the distance traveled, right? The distance that a nerve impulse will travel from this particular spot to this muscle wall and to this muscle wall is shorter distance than the nerve impulse that has to go from here to here to here, right? That is a much farther route to travel. And so the SA node is going to be sending these electrical stimuli out in all directions from this node, but those electrical signals are going to be received by the atria first and slightly in front of, or faster, than the muscle cells that are down here, just simply because they're farther from the SA node than the atria are. Okay, so the very first thing is the atria are going to contract. The second thing is the AV node, or the atrioventricular node, is going to receive this stimuli from the SA node and is going to relay the information to the ventricles, and that's going to cause the ventricles to contract second. Okay, ventricles are going to contract later, or at a slightly later time, just simply based on the fact that they're farther from the SA node than the atria are. Okay, so let's dive in a little farther. What are some of the stimuli? I talked right at the beginning on the thumbnail, or the beginning slide, about the fact that there are external stimuli that can affect the rate at which the heart is beating. And one of those stimuli are when blood CO2 levels are elevated. So let's paint a picture, okay? Set a scene. When you guys are at rest, your blood pressure remains relatively constant, your heart rate remains relatively constant, your oxygenation levels should be constant, your CO2 levels should be constant. But let's say that you go from resting and you decide to run down the halls, or you run to a friend's house, or you ride a bike, or you're playing a sport. Your heart rate, you will hopefully notice or appreciate, increases. Okay, why is it increasing? It's not increasing to match your level of exertion, directly speaking. It's elevated because your physical exertion has caused your body tissue cells to increase the rate of cellular respiration, causing them to increase the CO2 waste gas byproduct that they produced as a result of cell respiration, and therefore is causing an elevated CO2 level in your blood. Your brain receives the indication, or your brain receives the signal that your blood CO2 levels are elevated, and CO2 is actually kind of a toxin. It's a waste product, okay? It's a toxin to cells. It's a toxin to your body. It actually reduces the pH of your body, okay? It's acidic. It's an acidic molecule, and we want to get it out. So your brain is constantly kind of monitoring your heart beat, but it's also monitoring your blood composition. And so when the blood CO2 levels are elevated and the brain recognizes them as being elevated, it's going to externally speaking, because we're outside of the heart, send a signal in the form of a neuron, or in the form of an electrical impulse from the brain to the heart, specifically speeding up or telling the SA node to speed up the rate of contractions. So we have our brain. Your brain sitting up here. It is monitoring your blood chemistry or blood composition. When it recognizes your CO2 levels are elevating or getting elevated, it's going to send a signal to the SA node in the form of a neuron and in the form of a nerve impulse, which is going to cause the SA node to increase the rate at which it is sending signals in order to increase the rate of contraction. When it increases the rate of contraction, then it speeds up the heart rate. Because your brain is constantly monitoring blood composition or blood chemistry, it will too, just like it did to increase heart rate, recognize that once it has had a series of higher or quicker elevation or quicker contractions, it will soon recognize that your blood CO2 levels have been reduced. Okay? When your heart rate quickens, you respire more quickly, you breathe deeper, you exhale more, and you are successful, or hopefully successful, at reducing the CO2 levels from your blood. Your brain will recognize that your CO2 levels dropped, and it will send a response in the form of a nerve, again, to the SA node, causing the SA node to decrease the rate of contractions. This can be seen when you stop doing the physical activity, when you stop running, when you stop riding your bike, when you stop playing your sport, okay? And you go back to a time of resting, you will notice or appreciate that your heart will drop in its contractions. Your heart rate will drop. It'll go back to resting, okay? Why is it going back to resting? Your brain is telling it that it no longer needs to be elevated because your blood CO2 levels have been reduced. These are both neuron or nerve originating, okay, or nerve impulses. They're coming from the brain and they're nerve impulses. But there are external moderators to your heart rate that are not nervous system based. There are things called hormones like adrenaline and epinephrine that can externally moderate your heart rate as well. Hormones like adrenaline, okay, adrenaline meaning the fight or flight response, okay, the fight or flight hormone, the fight or flight molecule, is or can be secreted by the body, the adrenal glands, and can very, very quickly, rapidly increase the rate that your heart is beating, okay? Why does adrenaline get released? It is your fight or flight, true fight or flight response, which means it is a life or death situation, okay? Why does it need to be released? Because it needs to ready the body for intense ATP production, intense muscular contraction, intense running speed production, okay? The body needs to be prepped and readied for fighting or flighting in a true life or death situation, okay? Again, that can be hormone based. So, myocytes, typically at rest, are going to be controlled in-house, but there are things externally that can and will directly impact the rate at which the heart is beating based on either electrical impulses sent from the brain as the brain continues to monitor your homeostatic balance, and or hormones that can be readily secreted in fight or flight responses. Okay? Moving to the cardiac cycle. So this is specifically electrical stimulation. Again, we are talking about the in-house electrical stimulation that is sent from the SA node through the heart and how that electrical stimulation can be monitored with an EKG. So these little blips, or this little kind of graph-looking thing, is an EKG. You probably have seen them on, shows or, Grey's Anatomy, whatever, movies. But that is the meter that we use to measure electrical stimulation of the heart. We use it to look at heart health. We use it to see if there's anything wrong with the heart. But these are the different aspects of the EKG, and these are the different kind of things that are happening within the heart, which gives us the different portion of the EKG. The first thing, this little blip out in front of the main contraction, is the atria contracting, okay? So, as we just said, the first thing that happens is the sinoatrial node, the SA node or the pacemaker, is going to cause the atria to contract. This atria contraction is going to be seen or can be seen by this little blip on the EKG. Next, part of that EKG or part of the electrical impulse is going to hit the sinoatrial node, okay, or the atrioventricular node, okay, and that is going to relay the information down kind of the middle section of the heart and is ultimately going to reach the ventricles, which is going to cause the ventricles to contract, which is the main blip on each of the kind of the wavelengths of the EKG, okay? So, little blip here, that is your atria contracting from the stimulus sent by the SA node. The atrioventricular node is going to receive the stimulus as well. That can be seen by this little pause. It's just receiving the stimulus. It's the little kind of split-second portion where it is relaying the information. Now you can kind of see this slight drop, which is the ventricles receiving the signal, not contracting, but receiving the signal. The signal is being translated or transmitted through the heart, and then the really intense, strong muscle contraction of the ventricles will contract, causing this main blip on the EKG. So every heartbeat can be measured and recorded by these main blips on the EKG, okay? Obviously, every time you have a blip, that indicates a heartbeat, and so you can measure the heart rate based on EKG. And so by the time you look at kind of what's happening with all of these, you can look at the shape of the EKG, and that kind of gives you an idea of what's happening within the heart. Okay, now we're looking at phases of the cardiac cycle. Again, you can see that it has roughly the same shape. It's kind of elongated. Obviously, you do not want to see this much flat line. That would be bad. But we're just breaking down kind of the phases of the cardiac cycle. and it's not based on any kind of scale. All right. So, two terms that you need to understand right off the bat, diastole and systole. You can see that both atria and ventricles will enter diastole and systole. Systole basically means active contraction, and diastole means resting. So both the atria and the ventricles are going to have alternating kind of pauses or resting and contractions. Atrial systole happens first, ventricle systole happens second. Again, we've established that. We know that the atria contract first and the ventricles contract second. But basically what happens is the atrial, remember, or the atria contract first. The atrial contraction forces blood into the ventricles. So these AV valves, the atrioventricular valves, have to open, which allows the atria to contract and force the blood into the ventricles. While these AV valves are open, the SL valves are closed because we just want the blood to go from the atria to the ventricles, not be forced all the way up the arteries. So these AV valves open, the atria contract, it forces the blood into the ventricles. That is atrial systole, atrial contraction. When the atria are contracting, the ventricles are in diastole. Again, you don't want the atria to contract alongside or with the ventricles contracting, because if they're both contracting, what's going to happen to the blood, right? Atria are going to try to force the blood into the ventricles, but the ventricles would also be trying to force the blood back into the atria, so it doesn't happen. So it's slightly delayed, okay? Atria contract, forcing the blood into the ventricles. Ventricles fill up. They're in diastole. Now our ventricles are totally full, which means we need to go into our ventricle contraction. The first part of our ventricle contraction is going to be the AV valves close, because we don't want the blood to back up. AV valves close, SL valves are going to open, okay? And the ventricles are going to physically contract, causing the blood to leave the ventricles and enter the arteries, which are either going to be sent to the lungs or going to be sent to body tissues. When the ventricles are contracting, the atria are in systole. So you can see that once the ventricles contract, they are also now in diastole, but our atria are also in diastole. So this is total heart diastole. Nothing in the heart is contracting. This is totally between heartbeats. Blood is entering the atria. It's filling up. Both valves are closed. We want the valves to be closed because we want the atria to fill up. We don't want it just falling into the ventricle. We also want these valves to be closed so that the blood that just moved into the arteries doesn't back up. This is the point at which the heart is kind of the lowest in terms of blood volume. And then late ventricular diastole, again, we're going to be filling up, but that's going to lead into another round of atrial systole when the atria are totally full and they contract, forcing the blood into the ventricle, and we start all over again. Okay? Again, this kind of just goes through what I just said. Make sure, again, we've talked about the route that the blood takes through the heart. You know, or hopefully know, that it's a double circulation, okay, double loop. And hopefully you can appreciate when the valves need to be open and when they need to be closed, okay? When the atria are contracting, the AV valves need to be open and the SL valves need to be closed. When the ventricles contract, the AV valves need to be closed and the SL valves need to be open. When they're both in diastole, both valves need to be closed, okay? That's important. So, diving into kind of more along the lines of the EKG, but now we're going to end with a really in-depth discussion about this particular graph. Now, this particular graph is going to show you a side-by-side comparison of 4 variables. We have aortic pressure, we have atrial pressure, ventricular pressure, and ventricular volume, okay? We also have a little bit about the first heart sound, second heart sound, but all of these things are laid over the top of each other so that you can see the correlation or the lack of correlation between these things, All right. Talking about aortic pressure first. Aorta, or the aorta, is the artery that is leaving the heart. Okay. So when the ventricle contracts, blood is forced into the aorta, increasing the aorta pressure. That can be seen here. Aortic pressure is relatively stable until the ventricular pressure increases, which can be seen with this green line. Ventricular pressure is going to coincide with ventricular contraction. And when the ventricle contracts and increases the pressure within the ventricle, it's going to therefore force the blood into the aorta, which is going to directly correlate to an increase in aortic pressure. When the ventricular pressure is increasing, the aortic pressure is increasing. And notice there is just a slight delay because we need to contract the ventricle right before the blood is forced into the aorta before it too begins to take on the blood volume, which is going to cause it, or the artery within its structure, to increase in pressure as well. Okay, and then when the ventricular pressure drops, then the aortic pressure can drop as well. Looking at this orange line, this is atrial pressure. Okay, so this is the top zones, okay, or the top quadrants of the heart. When atria contraction or the atria contraction leads to an increase in atrial pressure, again, we are looking at this little blip, okay? Atrial pressure is going to increase, which is the orange line, and atrial pressure gradually increases due to the inflow of blood returning to the heart from the veins following systole. So, what is happening if we look at just this line? The atrial pressure increases when the atria contracts. Then it starts to fill up. As it fills up with blood, its pressure increases because the volume is increasing. Okay? Ventricular pressure in green. Again, when the atria contract, it's forcing blood into the ventricle, so the ventricles are going to take on exactly the same amount of volume of blood that the atria had in it. So when the atria contract, the ventricle pressure increases. But then when the ventricle contracts, which is slightly beyond the time when the atria contracts, right? Atria contracts first, then the ventricle contracts. When the ventricle contracts, the ventricular pressure increases substantially and therefore forces the blood into the aorta, because that's ultimately the vessel that leads from the heart, or leaves the heart, that takes the volume of blood that the ventricle had in it, okay? And then we look at ventricular volume. So in purple, ventricular volume, notice that it is kind of inversely related to ventricular pressure. As the ventricle contracts, it's forcing the blood out of the ventricle and into the arteries that are leaving the heart. Some of that blood, specifically talking about the left ventricle, is going to be leaving the heart into the aorta, heading to the body tissues, and the right ventricle is going to be sending the blood to the lungs. In both cases, when the ventricle contracts, it's going to lose blood volume, and so the blood volume of the ventricle is going to be reduced. Then, following the ventricle contraction, when the AV valves open, all of a sudden blood can fall in from the atria, which has been filling up with blood. AV valve opens, and now the blood falls from the atria through the open AV valves and begins to fill the ventricle, which is why the ventricular volume increases. Okay? So, increase in blood volume returns to the heart following systole. Meanwhile, this is the big one, right? Ventricular contraction causes the pressure to increase, but also causes the blood volume to decrease because the blood is physically leaving the ventricle. Again, it is likely that you will see a graph very similar to this on your IB exams. You need to be able to correlate all of these different variables to what is happening within the blood. So The reason I said up front that this particular topic, or this particular concept within 6.1, or 6.2 rather, is difficult, and it is because you have to have a really abstract mind, and you have to be able to visualize not only the blood flow through the heart, you have to be able to correlate that blood flow route to different variables, specifically aortic pressure, arterial pressure, or atrial pressure, ventricular pressure, and ventricular volume. If you know how the blood flows through the heart and know how atria impacts ventricular pressure, how atria pressure impacts ventricular volume, how ventricular pressure and ventricular volume impact aortic pressure, you'll totally understand this particular graph and be able to do well on your IB exams. If you have any questions, bring those to class. Otherwise, I'll see you later. Bye.